for one of the co-chairs for the eResearch Australasia. I just have a few housekeeping notes for you. So if you are not attending the conference dinner, could you please leave your ticket with the registration desk? Also, we have, you can get into a draw to win an iPad at the end of the conference if you fill the conference feedback form either on the app or in paper format at the back of the room. It's my pleasure to introduce Linda O'Brien, the Pro Vice Chancellor, Information Services at the Griffith University, and members of her panel, Sheena Reilly from the Griffith University and Ross Wilkinson from ANZ. Please welcome them. Thank you.
It's great to be here today. I always welcome the opportunity to do a bit of reflecting, and nothing like being asked to speak to give you that excuse to spend the time. I am keen today, though, that we try and have more of a conversation, so I'll skip through a few slides to start the discussion, but I'm absolutely delighted to have my friends Ross and Sheena here. Sheena is the Director of the Menzies Health Institute Queensland, based at Griffith, relatively newly arrived, and Ross, as you know, Executive Director of ANZ, and both of them share some passions of mine in terms of the potential future that we might create together. As a librarian, I've always been passionate about ensuring access to and curating the world's knowledge. Those of you that were in the earlier session would have heard me talk about standing on the shoulders of giants. If we don't preserve the knowledge as it's created for future generations to build upon, then we have a problem. I've always thought that knowledge, education, research is the key to future prosperity. It was a no-brainer for me. And always thought the librarians played an absolutely critical role in helping to create that information ecosystem that underpins knowledge creation and dissemination. I remember meeting Philippa Adams early in my career, who told me that he was educated. He never had the opportunity to have a university education, albeit that he is arguably an intellectual. He was educated by his local library and the librarian there who fed him a regular series of books to read. When the internet was first born, this is when I show my age, in Australia, I saw that as an amazing opportunity. I still being given the opportunity, remember, to sit in front of our Vice-Chancellor of the time to say what an amazing thing it was. He wasn't all that impressed. It was still a graphical user interfaces was still a way off. And the year after the internet was born, I actually spoke at a conference, a library conference. It was the first biennial ALIA conference. I described it as a time of rapid political, social, economic and technological change. Now, this is 25 years ago. I think we'd still say the same. And I think we're still saying that in such a competitive world, we need to be more innovative. So some things move slowly, some faster. You'll note the lovely mobile phones in the slide. So that's what mobile phones look like then. The iPhone was still 6 years away, Google 7 years away. Yet here we were talking about the need to be innovative and to see change as an opportunity. So I think that challenge is still with us. And certainly the technology moves much faster than our ability to respond. It was almost 10 years later in 2000 before we first started talking about eScience, and Tony Hayes here, he set up in 2001 the UK Science Centre. And later we started talking about eResearch as we saw the opportunity in the social sciences and humanities. It was really heralding that growing realisation that technology was transforming research, but as you heard Reese say earlier, the revolution hasn't come yet. And we haven't been, it's a very complex world, we haven't been as quick as some other industries to recognise that opportunity. By 2005, I was talking about partnerships. I was saying, well, we need to join hands here. If we're going to do eResearch well, The library professionals have to join hands with the IT professionals, the research office and the researchers if we're really going to realise benefit. And I was talking about the fact that research was becoming more multidisciplinary, more collaborative, more global, and more dependent on the capabilities offered through advanced networks and large data storage. Again, a familiar story. But now, 10 years on from then, everyone's talking about innovation. Everyone's talking about how do we build research into innovation in business and industry? How do we recognise and harness the knowledge economy potential to create that better future? For me, I've always thought that that was what creating a better future was about, but now we're seeing everyone from Business Council of Australia who's saying we live in a world where everything's tradable, and where knowledge and innovation are the key to driving prosperity, through to our Chief Scientist and indeed our new Prime Minister, who just, as I said last Friday, hosted a meeting in Sydney where he summoned university and research agency leaders to a private meeting to look at ways of finding how to drive more industry collaboration and innovative businesses and build from our research. It's pretty sobering to think 90% of the data in the world today was created in the last 2 years. And I think Reese mentioned that 1 day's data out of the square kilometre array is about what the internet pumps out in a day. Data collection and analysis is redefining how we think about ourselves and our world. How we do what we do, how we work, how we play, the sorts of skills and knowledge we need. Yet information as a resource is interesting. It's immensely valuable, but unlike other resources, it grows in value through sharing rather than withholding. It's a resource which we can extract value from in ways we've never thought possible, and data can now tell us a story we never knew. Talking to a theoretical economist, he was saying there aren't too many of them around now because most of the theories were debunked now that we have the data that tells us the way the economies are really working. It is an amazing time to be a library and information professional. I mean, who'd have thought what a fantastic opportunity this is. So rather than the internet, I mean, for me, it was never the demise of the library. It was really the rise of the librarian and our value and importance. It was great to be sent recently, after I'd agreed to speak, the strategic plan for Trinity College Dublin, where they've actually called out the fact that they have a responsibility in terms of the knowledge economy. Though they're talking about it as a financial responsibility, and they're just talking about contributing to that. I think we can go further than that. And there's been much written lately about the role of the librarian as a partner in the research endeavour, and I'm as guilty of that as anyone. Recently sharing this chapter with a good friend and colleague. But my premise today is that it's not just an opportunity that we have in the knowledge economy, it's actually an obligation to be a catalyst, to really make that positive difference. We can shape that global information ecosystem. We can clearly make a big dent in how that's thought about and how we contribute to it, to advance research and education, understanding and therefore ultimately prosperity. What I'd like to do is just give a few examples that I've had a really small part to play in, but for which I'm immensely proud of those that have contributed to achieving those outcomes, and I feel very privileged to have been part of it, to illustrate 3 ways that I think to try and indeed realise this opportunity we have. The first is, I think we need to completely focus on delivering value. John Seely Brown described the new normal as an era of constant disequilibrium, and he urged us to reframe our ways of working, our ways of creating value, our ways of innovating. So if we loop back to say what we're about is really fueling that knowledge economy, thinking about how we can provide access to and curate the knowledge that's being created in order to further research, and further knowledge dissemination, then how can we best do that? Let's keep stripping back to basics. You know, what's the best way to achieve that outcome? Is the way we've done it in the past the right way? When I was doing the article in 1990, I came across this article by someone called Barrett. He called it Can Be Ethics, the Science of Change. And he talks about 3 stages or levels at which we can engage with change, from the crudest and weakest to the most sophisticated and powerful. He said the first level is to cope with change, to survive. Second, capitalise on change to thrive. The third, create change to triumph. When I read that, I thought, that's me. You know, I want to be in that category. I don't want to be run over by the bus. I actually want to be driving it and helping to create that new future. So that's something I always try and bring to the conversation. And thirdly, don't underestimate the power of influence. When you've all would have seen the concentric circles, you know, the bit you can control, the bit you can influence, and then there's all that stuff out there that you shouldn't be losing sleep over because you can't do anything about it. My take is that the bit you can influence is far bigger than you realise. We often underestimate our power to make a difference there. Encourage you to build and sustain networks of smart and connected people. There's a whole bunch here of people that I'm catching up with again that fall into that category, including my colleagues over here, because you never know when you can enlist them in your cause to create that better future, or when you can support them in their cause where it's adding to your desire to create that knowledge information ecosystem. A few examples. Terra Nova is one. Terra Nova is the Australian Climate Change Adaptation Information Hub, a big mouthful. It exists to support effective climate change adaptation research and responses by improving accessibility and availability of climate change adaptation data, information, decision support tools and climate model visualisations. It's been enormously successful. It's only a few years old. Griffith hosts it, but there are many partners in this initiative. For me, when it was first mooted, it epitomised the research library of the future from my perspective. We've had huge buy-in from the research community, but also from government agencies. We're now ingesting government data from across the nation and increasingly attracting research funding of a variety of kinds, including AusAid funding, to start to work with the South Pacific Islands, who are clearly exposed to the impacts of climate change. Library and information professionals have been integral to thinking through and developing the metadata schema and promoting and educating in its use. Yet when Ross first came to Griffith and said, I've got a little bit of money, I think you guys do good stuff in climate adaptation, we went to talk to the academics and they didn't think it was of value. It was quite amazing. I'm sure Ross remembers the day. And I thought, well, I'm not going to give up that easily. For me, this looks like a really great way to create value, to create change that's going to be of significance. And so I went out and influenced. I talked to the DVC research. I talked to anybody that would listen about this great opportunity. And we had a newly appointed academic who'd yet to arrive to head up our climate change area. The minute he hit the ground, I was there. Brendan, have I got a deal for you? And it was fantastic. He got it completely from the minute we spoke, just as Sheena got it completely from the minute we spoke about the opportunities. I mean, she was there already. She didn't need my help. And so jointly we've continued to work to try and create change to triumph, to do good work in terms of thinking about creating that research library of the future and furthering research knowledge. And currently we're co-funding an academic who's at the UN. He's developed a 3D visualisation of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, amazingly complex, I might add. And he's at the Global Landscapes Forum in Paris presenting it, and hopefully it will become a tool within this toolkit. The next example, Open Data Institute Queensland. Out of the Terra Nova experience and through others, I'd become increasingly alert to the opportunities that government data provided to underpin research. If we could only harness that data, and there was a lot happening, a lot of conversation around open data in government, but not a lot happening. And I thought, well, what can I do about it? How can I influence an outcome? I brought up Pia Waugh from the federal government to talk about open data a couple of times as our Friends of the Library event, and I started building networks of people that cared. We know that as a nation we're doing amazingly good stuff in the research data space, but it was pretty clear to me that in the government space we were lagging, and there was this opportunity to really leverage this abundant resource of data in a way that would further research, further knowledge, and really provide a fantastic opportunity. So the Friends of the Library events were great. I built some networks, I found some interested people, but I thought that's really not enough. How do we move from there? Gold Coast City Council had started talking about becoming a node of the Open Data Institute in the UK, and I thought, well, that sounds like a great idea, I'll help. So after unsuccessfully pitching this idea to my Vice-Chancellor, who said, well, it looks like a really worthy cause, but it's bigger than the university, I thought, well, who else do I know that might be interested? And I reached out to a senior partner in an information-based consulting firm that I'd met through the Friends of the Library, Neil Makepeace, who shared my passion. And as I say, the rest is history. A year ago, Neil tapped a whole lot of friends he had on the shoulder, and we managed to get Microsoft, Lang & O'Rourke, Telstra, NICTA, my university, and Neil's company Glentworth to be foundation sponsors and appoint Marie Adshed as our founding CEO. She's floating around here somewhere. I know she was here yesterday. We'll be here tomorrow if you want to know more. And we are now starting to help promote and build capability around open data, and I think there's a huge opportunity there to leverage that into knowledge creation, dissemination. Last example, which again you'll hear some more about tomorrow if you come along to our Birds of a Feather session, is ORCID. Again, with all of these, I've only had a small part to play, but I think by focusing on those three ways, influencing, creating change to thrive, and thinking about how you deliver value, you can actually make a real difference. July last year was when we had the ORCID roundtable. I remember distinctly at the end being extremely excited about the opportunities that I could see for researchers, for the nation, for research agencies, if we all embrace this national approach to researcher identification. We could streamline a whole lot of systems, improve data flows. It was just this fantastic opportunity to be part of this global initiative. And I think at the end I told, Ross was chairing the last session, I told him we were going to save the world by doing this amazing thing. And he was ever the thoughtful, like, manage your expectations here, Linda. We can't solve everything instantly. But we did agree that we'd get a coalition of the willing together to talk about where we went to from here. And when the lovely Natasha Simons from ANZ and I sat down to kind of map it out, I could see not only what we had to do, but who could drive it. In terms of the Australian Access Federation, and Ross said, no, we're not ready for the solution yet. We've got to get the commitment first. So between my enthusiasm and his political astuteness and careful shepherding, we've actually now on the cusp of signing that consortium agreement. I think we've got more than 40 institutions lined up to sign, which is a pretty impressive task. And the AAF, true to form, the wonderful Heath, they've done such a good job on changing the agreement with ORCID. ORCID's going to adopt that as the new international standard. So all in all, big ticks for us. Laurie's here, I think, or will be here, and she said that's one of the shortest times in which that's gone from idea to conception that she's ever seen of any of the countries she's dealing with. So good stuff. So I guess just in conclusion, we can make a difference. We can add value. We can create this new global information ecosystem to underpin knowledge creation and dissemination. and which hence underpins future prosperity. Our Prime Minister in his victory speech said, "The Australia of the future has to be a nation that's agile, that is innovative, that is creative. We can't be defensive, we can't future-proof ourselves. We have to recognise the disruption that we see driven by technology. The volatility and change is our friend if we're agile and smart enough to take advantage of it." What I heard was somebody saying what I said 25 years ago, and I think that's a pretty inspiring message, and I guess I'd encourage us all to think we can go out there and make a difference. I'd like to ask my friends to the right now, Sheena and Ross, to add to that conversation, challenge or reaffirm, and then we'll open it up for questions. Over to you guys.
Okay, David. Data can very much be rubbish, and librarians can be very much too nice. So we need to fix that. Librarians have to stop being quite so nice. They have to follow Linda's pushy thing, you know, get out there and push a bit harder. They have to do a bit more, because data will be a big problem and rubbish unless information professionals make it actually valuable. So you can't just sit back and let people come to you and help them when they're there, you know, the nice model. Librarians have got to get out there, push and prod and poke, just like Linda. So it's no good simply providing services when you're ready. So let me pick on a couple of people. Matthias, I can see you there. So Curtin, instead of having some data that sat in a pleasant archive that enabled some researchers to do some better work, transformed what they had into something that enabled a strong connection between industry, research and the Western Australian government. And pivotal to the success of that work was the fact that university librarians, indeed Matthias, got out there and got close to people to work on making that data more valuable. So the library stops being responsive and starts being a joint custodian with researchers on establishing high value information environments where not only researchers can get value, we're going to hear about how that could happen, but also industry gets value, schools get value. So libraries stop being the place where nice people sit and researchers come once in a while, if they're not engineers. I mean, obviously they don't come ever, but if you wait for them to come, you're not going to get what you need. Kind of need to get out there and establish an information environment that's really attractive. And when it does work, it really makes a difference. We've even got some librarians in ANZ who start being not nice and start asking questions about why doesn't your water data talk to my water data? How can you do that better? And then they get into sort of metadata schemas and crosswalks and all sorts of interesting things, so you can do stuff. But the first thing is to get out there and ask the questions and make these things happen. And when it does happen, the library stops being a place where nice people live and researchers occasionally go, to being a vital component of the research output of the university and as a way of connecting to all of these other communities.
So I'm a clinician and a researcher, and I presented to my new institute a week ago about a new direction for the institute. And one of the things I said to, there were probably 400 or 500 researchers who were in the room or on other campuses. I said, my vision is that in 5 years' time, maybe it'll take 10. I hope it doesn't. But my vision is that we do not apply for funding ever again to go out and collect data. My vision is that we use data that is already available and we use it better than we currently do. I currently got attacked by a few people, but I expected that. And of course, you'll want to enhance the data that might be available. But we have so much data in our systems that we do not mine and we don't use. And I would contend that the average academic doesn't know how to get access or how to use some of that data. And some of it is tied up in all sorts of privacy issues and things that we have to solve as part of our healthcare system. So how many of you wear a Fitbit or monitor your health, your steps, your sleep patterns or something or other on a device? Well, you're an unusual group because there's not that many of you, although there's a lot more hands went up. So not quite half, maybe 30-40% of the room. But this is becoming increasingly common. And I think the latest statistics say that about 500 million people around the world now access some type of app to monitor some aspect of their healthcare. It's really easy to do, and every few weeks there's thousands and thousands more apps that get uploaded to iTunes or whatever that you can download to monitor whatever you like. So the technology there is there to monitor health. Within our health system, we have masses of data. I just have to read this figure to get it right. In the UK alone, over 1 million images, from chest x-rays to brain scans, whatever type of image you want to conjure up, are uploaded to their health service database, the UK National Health Service database, every day. Every day. So start thinking about how many images that is over a year that could actually be used. Ask any researcher that works in the field of imaging how difficult it is to get people to volunteer for studies that involve imaging. If you've got the problem that's being researched, of course you'll volunteer, but try and get controls, try and get other people to come in as a comparison. Can't do it. And yet all this data sits in our system. In the US, almost a quarter of people now use technology to track their health in some way, and hospitals increasingly use all sorts of social media to track health. So my challenge is, why aren't we using some of the data that sits in our system? So let's come out of hospitals and think about community. We measure children's health and well-being in all sorts of ways throughout their early life, but we never link up the data that we collect. We use it in one way at a particular time to decide which children might be at risk and need to go off and have a further investigation and which children don't. We don't ever link it up longitudinally or use it to think about the sort of outcomes we could improve for children and improve for families. Chronic disease, increasing, it's going to be the most huge burden on Australian healthcare in the future. The sort of chronic disease that we're dealing with now is complex. It doesn't get fixed by going to your GP or a one-off consultation with someone in a healthcare system. It involves multiple healthcare agencies and multiple clinicians from healthcare systems. And you can bet your bottom dollar none of that is connected up in any way that allows us to get a whole picture of that person's healthcare. And yet it's doable. It's doable in our system. So chronic disease might be the biggest challenge we've got, but how we use the data that is already in our systems to improve health outcomes is a real challenge and also an opportunity for us to get right in Australia. The way the government are currently talking, for the first time in a long time, one starts to think, don't get too hopeful, but maybe. And they're already doing some of this in New Zealand and starting to do it extremely well. They're connecting up their databases across a whole load of sectors. We can't even get it done in health yet, but they're connecting across different sectors, health, education, custody, prisons, you name it. And they're starting to do some really interesting work where that data sits in hubs and can be analysed. So I'd love to see those sorts of conversations happening. I know some of the questions I want to answer in health, but I don't have the expertise to know how to manage or store or catalogue any of this data. And I think that's where you guys could come in to help us, and we could form really valuable partnerships to do some of this stuff. So I'll stop there.
Okay, questions? of any of us about anything we've said or about anything else? Yes, Matthias.
There's one in the front.
Oh, I'm close to the microphone, so I win.
Oh, okay. David.
So your point about the amount of data, I put my hand up when you said, do you use a device to track your fitness? And I have a Fitbit, and I was wearing it on Sunday. I'm not wearing it today because I didn't bring it with me because I forgot. And I think there's a problem with that idea of all of these things out there, is that humans aren't actually very good at doing those things regularly. That you end up with data sets that are patchy because people forget. I wear my Fitbit intermittently, even though I should think about it more often. I'm supposed to be doing one of those 10,000 steps challenges next week, and I think I'm going to have to be much better at it because I'm not going to know how I'm doing. But I think there's a real problem there, I guess, in the sense of there's lots of data, but it's very patchy data in a lot of senses, and trying to patch that stuff together, I think, makes it hard. And I think it's made harder because people are nervous about what you're going to do with it, which I think is the other thing. The Fitbit people, when I signed up to make it work with my phone, wanted to know my name. And I thought, why? Why do you need to know my name? This is my data. This is my information. I'm doing it because I'm interested in how many steps I take. But why should I tell Fitbit? And in fact, my setup is why do you need to know is in fact my name and my Fitbit account. Because I just don't know, or I don't see why that should be any business of theirs. And I guess that's the other question I have is how do we manage that privacy issue? Because the bigger the data, the more identifiable people become.
Look, I totally agree with those points you just made. The biggest issue is obviously the privacy point. The situation you just described, I witnessed my sister doing exactly the same thing with her first Fitbit the other night and signing up. And I'm thinking, oh, she's putting all her details in there as she links her Fitbit to her phone. And my point around the Fitbit is not that we should be connecting everybody's Fitbits to some enormous database. The point is that we have technology that we could use to collect really good data about specific cohorts. So, for example, if you're a patient that has some type of chronic disease and activity and exercise is part of it, then I bet you're probably quite motivated to use whatever the device is to actually record aspects of your health. Whatever data set you collect, there's always going to be holes in it and there's always going to be missing data. That's a constant problem, even when you go out and design it in the most perfect way. But I think one of the biggest issues is around privacy, and particularly when it comes to health data. And I get a bit frustrated by it because banks know everything about us. My bank knows what medications I take, how often I buy them. They know where I go in the world. They have algorithms about my spending. They're giving my data to stores to say, this is happening, to say, oh, she often buys this, so you might want to tell her that this is on sale. She likes clothes from that shop, or she buys the shoes here. That sort of stuff is already happening, and that doesn't seem to bother us in the same way that health data bothers us, and I wonder why.
Can I make a couple of quick comments?
I'd rather give them my health data.
Yeah, absolutely. I attended a talk not long ago where a person talked about the use of the new Apple health app on their phone with the view to bringing a cohort of 100,000 Alzheimer families into a study. And they were able to do that because if you're in Alzheimer, if you're a carer, if you're involved in the family, you have motivation. So they can bring new levels of information with consent much, much more easily than any group that Sheena could run ever, because the cost is just different. Now, the problem is that data needs to be made not rubbish, it needs to be made good data, so that means you need information professionals. Now, the other group, and I bet there's none of them here, are the wretched statisticians. Are you, anybody willing to admit you're a statistician here? No, I didn't think so. Because the statisticians have to get their act together. They have to spend more time analysing dirty data than lovely, beautiful, curated data that comes out of an environment that might inform the design that can be run in a small lab, but not will inform the data in that space. So we need information professionals of a number of different forms in this space. Yes, we need to have less polite librarians, but equally we need to have more engaged statisticians. So there's more to be done in that space. But if it is done, the power of the investigation changes dramatically. And it stops being, how can I analyse a careful data set, but how do I pull this data together with that other data? Now, the great thing is that I think we've got a better chance of doing that here in Australia and possibly with our New Zealand colleagues than anywhere else at the moment in the world, because there's actually a will to do this. So get on board is, I guess, my message, that there's really a fantastic opportunity in this space now.
Yeah, I guess the other thing I'd say, and I mean, Sheena alluded to this in another project she was involved with when we had our chat, is that if you said to someone, are you happy for your data to be used for research purposes? Tick the box here. And you know, A. B, if we find anything interesting, do you want us to get back to you? Tick the box here. I think you get quite a lot of buy-in if they know what it's for. I mean, the Fitbit example's a bit different when it's some corporate and you don't know what they're going to do with it. But if it was the Menzies Health Institute asking me through the hospital or through my local, I'd go tick the box, you know. So I think, you know, there is an opportunity there. It's just working out how to leverage it.
I mean, there are places in the US in particular, whole hospitals now where as soon as you cross the threshold, you're a participant in research unless you actively opt out, and it's part of the care you get at the hospital. And there's a lot of discussions happening that maybe that's the way we should be thinking about some of the way we set up our hospitals as well, because we don't want to use that data for bad purposes. We want to use it for good purposes, which is about feeding back into better healthcare, improved outcomes, and lowering the costs of what we do, and being able to predict things that might happen to people so we can intervene and change their pathways, or at least give the individual an opportunity to do that. But as it stands at the moment, it's actually very difficult to do. If you're working with biological data and you're collecting DNA from anyone, you just have to be upfront. Of course, it's identifiable data. It will never, ever, you can never claim that it isn't, because having someone's DNA means you can identify them if you wanted to go off and do something so stupid. But, you know, we do that all the time in our big research studies, whether we're collecting biological data or not. But it's pretty easy to get that data now. You don't actually even have to ask for permission. You can grab a hair saliva sample.
You have a question at the back there. Hi.
Was that me now?
Yes.
Oh, I'm not at the back, I'm at the front. Sorry, confuse me. Now, I was actually going to respond to David's comments about messy data that he's producing, but it's already been responded to by the panel. So I'm going to go into something completely different. I like to think one of the reasons why our project, which you called me out for, thanks Ross, the reason why we were quite so successful is because we worked with a facility who's entirely self-sufficient in terms of funding and gets all of its money from clients paying to use its instruments. And I'm wondering, if we made libraries and librarians a little more dependent on outside funding, whether librarians would stop being so nice, if we forced them to be more aggressive in getting their money.
I can't answer that question, but you two could.
Yeah, well, money may or may not be a good incentive. It's certainly, being able to grab bits of money has allowed us to build capability, but we've got the short-term contract problem then, because, you know, you build good capability and skills, but then you haven't got the next lot of money coming. So there's a place, I mean, there is a place for it, but I would like to think we can build long-term sustainable staffing profiles that do cool things with researchers without needing to be beholden to the next grant, which puts those staff at risk.
So, yes, but I reckon libraries could spend much more time working out how much value they've added to the data that would otherwise be rubbish. And if they start measuring that value, then it gets back to that question, my library's costed me what per annum, and you're spending it on books, really? So the conversation starts being, we've established an internationally significant collection in whatever, doesn't matter, but the value of that collection is directly tied to the efforts of the library as custodians of that data in concert with the research group. But, you know, the value becomes, if Sheena has her way and there is no data collected by her institute in 5 years' time, that means that they're going to be at least 40% more efficient as a research institute, because they're not going to be spending all that time gathering the data, and data costs a lot to gather. So there's a big saving there. But the library's actually going to have to stop just doing good things and start measuring the goodness of the things that they do, and start asking the question, well, how much value did we add? And if we didn't add value, why not? Because there's opportunity there. Now, the great thing is that I think the library system in Australia is better positioned to do that than virtually any in the world, because there's been a lot of effort done by quite a number of you here in the audience to make that a better position. But until you're actually measuring value in a way that matters within the institution, it's going to be hard. You're going to have to be nice. You don't want to do that.
There's someone right up the back there.
No, it's Tony.
Oh, Tony.
Tony, hey, just to remind Ross, he owes me a beer. It's about the generating money and value. The example I like is of the Cornell Library, which hosts Archive, which is this repository used by particle physicists and mathematicians and astronomers and things. And it was just done on a wing and a prayer and grants and things, but now it's run by the library. So how do they support it? Well, actually, they measure the number of downloads from each university in the US over the year, and they send them a small bill for a few $1,000s. And actually, most of them pay that bill. And that actually gives them some stability in hosting a repository. Now, I think they have to go further. They have to put data and they have to think about software and so on, but that's at least a start. And it is a model of the self-sustaining archive that you might like to consider.
It's a good example.
Yeah, I'll give you the beer, I suppose.
Can I give you an example of how this is working using purely de-identified data at the moment that allows you to target health problems and prevention in communities? And this is happening in a community not that far from here, where de-identified data is being used to identify mums at risk during pregnancy. And the example I'll give is mums who are smoking heavily during pregnancy. So the data never links back to an individual, but what it does is link back to an area in a particular community. So you could say that quarter of this community in this lecture theatre has a problem because there are 20 out of 60 heavily pregnant mums who are smoking, and we want to stop that smoking. Now, you're never going to go and target an individual, but what you're going to do is run a whole load of prevention in that community to try and reduce smoking. And it's actually been quite effective. You're not stopping all the mums smoking, but you're actually cutting it by half, because what you're doing is actively targeting not everybody in the community, because not everyone in the community needs it, but that quarter of the community need it. So there's all sorts of ways really good population level data can be used in planning, so that you're not wasting your resources rolling it out to the whole community. You're actually targeting the parts of the community that need it. And that's completely de-identified use of data.
So I should say that I'm absolutely in favour of open data, and I used to work for ANZ.
No, I thought you were.
So I guess I'm interested in the motivations behind that. And you said before, why do we let banks have all this data about us? And the reason is because banks provide a convenient service. The reason they know all that about you is because they have FPOS machines and credit cards. And because they have FPOS machines and credit cards, we don't have to carry huge amounts of cash, and we can get money on Saturdays and all that other stuff. And so we've traded that off. And the thing about the health side for me is that, yes, some people who are at risk will be advantaged, but lots of people who won't are thinking, well, what's in it for me? There's the altruism thing is lovely, and we've all used the altruism thing, and also, it comes up in the open access discussions, it comes up in discussions on data, and we know that it has a very limited life, really. Realistically, most people will say, yes, it's nice, I want to do something for people, but when the rubber hits the road, most people, it comes a long way down their list of things, as opposed to things where they can see an actual value in their life. And I think that's a challenge in all sorts of things that we do, not just data, but the whole thing. And I guess related to that is the whole problem of, then what is the value that we're going to give these people, and how do we actually measure that? And I think that's a real problem for libraries. And at my library, I work for Monash. We're really interested in this question at the moment. That question of what does the library bring to the institution? This is one of the things that we think is valuable, but it's not the only thing that we think is valuable either. And how do we measure the impact we have on the institution or on any of these things is really, really hard. If we make data available, does that increase the amount of funding that the university gets for future research? Did it create more citations of our data, which counts towards our ranking? Did we solve some problem that we couldn't solve before? How much of a solution, of a contribution did we make to that problem is really, really hard. And how much of it was all the other things that go into a problem? So, I think it's this value thing is a really big, complicated thing. And, we're very committed to trying to make data valuable, but I don't, how you then say, well, what did that actually result in is really hard.
The good thing is that it is really hard, actually, because it represents opportunity. If it was easy, everybody would already be doing it and the problem wouldn't be there. The fact that it's not that easy to work out value in all of these different spaces. Now, obviously, because you've worked for ANZ in the past, you're asking all of the right questions. As a result of working for Monash, you actually have to answer them now. So if you like, we want to encourage that sort of conversation. So one's thinking about, well, what's the value? So Sheena articulated the value to her group, taking away 40% of the cost of research by having data in a form that enables you to do it. Now, I'm making up 40% because that's what I do. But whatever it is, it's something of very significant value. So what's the equivalent value in the measurement of rocks, which is what Matthias cares about enormously? What is it that will represent value in the tropics? To which groups? And how does the library transform so that, in fact, it's clear why Monash is valuable to its community beyond its research community, and how might data play a role in that? So I reckon those are exactly the right questions to be asking and then exploring, because if the answers emerge, and they will be different for different parts and different institutions and different faculties, etc., but having answers to those questions are exactly the right thing.
You have a question? Yep.
It's Peter Hunter from Auckland University. It just occurred to me, and it's probably obvious to you who think about these issues all the time, but one of the big problems for funding agencies, and I can speak in particular about experience with the Marsden Fund in New Zealand, one of the big problems is they're very conscious of the need to, given that it's public good funding, to ensure that the outputs of research are maintained beyond the length of the grant and are available for public use. But the question always comes down to who carries the cost of that long-term maintenance of that data. So isn't there an obvious role for libraries and universities to be involved in working with funding agencies to be the providers of guaranteed long-term support for information that comes out of research grant, publicly good research grants?
Absolutely. Can I fill you in on some thinking occurring in Europe at the moment, which is that the data that emerges from research must be publicly available. So that's a well understood fact. And the open data initiative has attracted 80% of those putting for funds are accessing the $1.4 billion fund that supports openness in that space. So 80% of sought funds are saying we will make our data open. Then the question is, who's going to make sure that that data is not only open, but is findable, accessible, interoperable and reusable? Now, I don't know that every library is going to run a repository of all of that material, but the library should absolutely have a role in determining where that data goes. It may well be the case that for some of the data, it takes a specific role, like the Cornell example, where there's been a very specific target in that space. But Auckland University may well make a decision for bioinformatics data, we will use the international repositories, and for the area we're particularly strong on, which might be archaeology, I've got no idea, but we will in fact become an international host of data in that space, driving up the value of the university library in that context. So that's where that strategy gets into the game. But I think whatever the data is and wherever it goes, the library is a highly valuable group of people, not an institution, a group of people who can make those long-term data decisions, because you're actually in a good position to do so, and much better, in fact, than my esteemed colleague, who might be a terrific epidemiologist, but probably hasn't thought about how to keep data alive for 100 years terribly much.
I guess the other thing I'd add, though, is that in the national conversation, hence my question, Philip Clark this morning, we haven't really joined up that conversation around long-term sustainable funding around the information infrastructure when it comes to content that underpins research. So we've had the traditional library model, you have a library, you purchase material, make it accessible. And then there's the data piece that's crept into the conversation. But when we talk about things like research infrastructure block grant funding, rarely do people see this as part of the research infrastructure. So we need to do a bit of educating around that space so that federal funding policies actually recognise the value of that infrastructure.
So I'm just wondering, though, whether when a university researcher gets a grant from public good funding agencies, and that is always hosted by the particular institution that that person works for. So then, in a way, they're accepting some responsibility, and they're taking some of the overheads associated with that grant. Couldn't there be an arrangement where you just automatically have a certain percentage that is going to the library to maintain the long-term sustainable access to the data that comes out of that grant?
I can't speak for New Zealand, but in Australia, research funding is inadequate to cover the costs of the infrastructure that underpins it, unfortunately. And that's a known problem. I mean, that's a current active discussion at the federal government level.
And there is absolutely no way we've tried, you can actually build this sort of padding into your grant. It's not padding, it's wrong. It would be seen and interpreted as padding. There isn't enough scope in existing grant systems to even get funding for secondary or reanalysis of data sets. The system is so squeezed at the moment. So, I mean, what you're talking about would be absolutely ideal. There's a way of archiving and keeping that data live so it can be used and reused. But that's up to individual institutions at the moment. Some are making efforts to do something about it and others not at all.
So I think the European Commission will go down that path relatively soon. And I think Australia will pay attention to that and make changes, and New Zealand funders may well do the same. So my sense is that while there is not a revenue stream for that at the moment, libraries that are looking to the future will be very well prepared for engaging in that environment. I think we don't have a good system of data repositories in Australia or anywhere. There are specific good examples in Australia and overseas for some areas, but not if you've just got general data. So there's a need for having institutions thinking hard about, well, how are we going to manage a system of data repositories, some which we might manage, some which we might contract out to, but there has to be funding for that because it's not an added extra. What we saw in Philip Marcus Clark's presentation before is that they're taking infrastructure seriously. This is part of that, and I think Linda's point in that conversation was, well, yes, it's people and yes, it's infrastructure. Make sure data is considered infrastructure.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh, to have full cost funding, that would be amazing.
It's such a great dialogue. I'm sorry to have to interrupt it. Thank you for such a thought-provoking conversation and presentation. And could you please join me in thanking the panel members?
Thank you, no.